the English Civil War. It didn't quite happen that way, of course, but we got the groundwork laid to look at the English Civil War and the Puritans tonight, I pray. And as we do that, we're going to try to divide this up between this week and next week. Next week, we're talking about the doctrine of the Reformation. I want to do that through the lens of what we'll begin to kind of hit toward the edges of tonight, but the Westminster Assembly and its confession, catechisms, and book of order, and also the Baptists and their two great statements, the London Confessions, and also the Savoy Declaration, which was the similar document done by the Congregationalists in England. So that's going to be kind of our lens at looking at reformational doctrine. We've seen some of the reformational doctrine along the way, but that'll be kind of our porthole to look out, I guess, and see a picture of these things. So we'll be dealing with the Puritans a little bit next week as well. But as I said, tonight's lesson will build upon the history we've been covering over the last several weeks. After the death of the last Tudor monarch, which was Elizabeth I, there was great hope. We talked about how Elizabeth had really locked down the Church of England and Anglicanism to really be under her authority, to be a state church that she had control over. And this was very important to her to kind of gain control over the religious battles that were waging for many years before her. And so you had an Anglicanism that was Protestant. It was Protestant. And there was some degree to which everybody can agree that we're within a stream, but there's a lot of battles within that stream, aren't there? There's some people saying we need to go further. And we've said often, I guess, the Puritans represent kind of a reformation within the Reformation, the argument of the Reformation to continue reforming. And the Church of England said, no, we've gone far enough. We've got the order we want, the rules we want. The Queen is satisfied. It's good enough, and that's what it's going to be. But those that believed in reform never lost sight of what they believed is we need to go past what the Queen says to what God says. And that is the way they would have defined it. You know, it's great that we've come 70% of the way, 80% of the way, whatever number you'd assign it. But God's word represents the standard, and he calls us to go all the way and to follow him in obedience wherever he would lead us. So this was the battle going on. And they had hoped, as we said over the last several weeks, that when James would come to power, who they learned later on would be the one to ascend to the throne next, that this would represent our chance, our opportunity to do this. James was raised in Presbyterianism. From what we hear, he is a committed Presbyterian, only it wasn't quite so. You know, he gained a lot of benefit from growing up with Presbyterian tutors and those who were overseeing him, but he also began to, I guess, have a grudge against some of those men who were not respectful, I think he thought, enough of him as the King of Scotland to be. And that, you know, they bossed him around, they treated him like a pupil, which he was at that point. You know, he's not yet king, but he thought he should have more deference than they gave him. And he didn't like the system of elders. You know, he makes this clear later. He says that elders and the king have about as much in agreement as the devil and God. You know, so his idea was these elders, they puff their chest up on the word of God as if they have equal say to me. He said, it's not so with bishops. I've seen this from Elizabeth's reign. The bishops have their proper place. They understand authority. And you might think of like the centurion who said, I'm a man over others and under others, so I know something of authority. That's the way he saw the bishops. They understood authority because the local church pastors were under bishops. And the bishops were under the archbishop. And the archbishop was under Elizabeth. And he said, that is a system I can get behind, right? Because it has its proper flow, and I'm at the top of it. And kings like that sort of thing. So when James comes, he's not going to be as agreeable to what the Puritans think, or I should say the kind of puritanical elements within the Church of England. He's not going to be as agreeable to what they're looking for as they think he will be. And we talked about this last week. They meet him on the road coming, and they hand him their desires, and he says, okay, we'll call a conference. I didn't realize there's all this disputing. Calls the Hampton Court Conference in 1604. They're going to iron out the differences between the, as we said, kind of the high church elements of the Anglican Church and the more reform-minded elements of the Anglican Church. And to the frustration of the reform-minded element, the more puritanical element, he sides like 97% with the high church elements, or the ones that want to keep it the way it already is structured. In fact, the only really sizable thing that they're given is a new Bible translation, right, which we talked about last week, the authorized version. He authorizes this version to be put together. And Bill, you asked last week about some details about that. I looked very quickly this week. 54 scholars from the Church of England were invited to participate in this. Only 47 actually did, but 54 were invited to. And they represented both sides, if you will, of the dispute. There were more Puritan-leaning people and more high Anglican-leaning people in the group, in the conference that was called together. And what's interesting about it was they worked on this for a little over half a decade, and they did it by dividing up into subcommittees. So they would have multiple subcommittees working on different areas of the Scriptures. So you had Old Testament teams who were more fluent with the Hebrew, New Testament teams more fluent with the Greek, and then there were some teams that were assigned to the Apocrypha that had the smallest number. And they translated all 80 books, that sounds weird to our ears to say, all 80 books of the Bible in just over half a decade. The Apocryphal team ended first, obviously. It's the shortest assignment. But what they would do is they put multiple teams on the same passage, have them work through the passage, and then they would come and do like a reconciliation. If you know anything about the way Congress works, the House will pass a bill, the Senate will pass a bill, and then it'll go to a reconciliation committee where they iron out those differences, whatever they are. The same thing would happen here. Two subcommittees would come up with their writing of Joshua chapters 1 through 3, and they would sit down together and compare them, and where there were differences, they would iron them out and submit it to the full committee. So they did this over just over half a decade and came up with this amazing translation of the Scriptures, which we talked about last week, the Authorized Version or King James Version. If you ever hear the King James Version termed the Authorized Version, that's where it comes from, right? That it was authorized by the crown that it would be put together. So anyway, so that's a little bit what we talked about last week. So outside of that, the Puritans didn't get very much, right? They just didn't get very much. James liked a system in which the king is at the top. And, you know, we all know the hearts of men, right? We like to be at the top of the chain. And so again, we can recognize here that there is some frustration early on. It will continue because we mentioned last week, and it's an important theme to lead to the English Civil War, that James argued for the divine right of the monarchy. In other words, my power does not come from Parliament. It doesn't come from the Magna Carta, no matter how important that document is. It comes from God. God created kings. He created me. He created me as king. You've recognized that by installing me as king and coronating me as king, and therefore your only proper response is to obey. That's really what it is. He humored Parliament because it was a fixture, but he recognized, he was at least arguing, putting forth the argument. Now, what made James unique, I think, in this is he knew boundaries. He seemed to be a wise ruler. He didn't push too far. You know, you can stand on a position that you think is solid, and the next thing you know, it's shifting around under your feet and you're gone. This will happen to his son, more or less. James never pushed too far. I mean, the furthest he pushed was he did dissolve Parliament several times, which a king could do. They could call for the dissolution of Parliament and then later recall a new Parliament. By the way, the king or queen has the right to request that to this day. In those days, it wasn't a request, it was a command to dissolve. And James did that several times when they didn't do what he wanted, which happened quite frequently. But over the years, he knew when not to push too far. And we talked about some of his policies that were already causing some dissatisfaction, him trying to colonize Ireland, which was thoroughly Catholic, more so than he wanted. He tried to colonize some Scots there who were thorough Protestants, to try to bring Protestantism into Ireland, having them intermarry, maybe seeing something of the way the Samaritan peoples came about, you know, but the intermarrying of Jews and the Assyrians, that maybe this would be a model. And it doesn't go very well, as we see for the next, you know, hundreds of years, as there's conflict in Ireland between Protestants and Catholics. It's also where we get Scots-Irish from, right? You hear about Scots-Irish that had a major role in our own country. They come from the blending of these peoples through this act that James did to try to put Ireland, which is already under his throne, but try to put them thoroughly under the Church of England. what he proposes, I would argue, what he proposes as a claim of a right, his son Charles tries to actually rule by. That's one of the points I was trying to get across to you last week. Charles decides it's not just talk, right? If we're going to say that I have a divine right to rule, I'm going to rule that way. And Parliament's not going to tell me what to do. I'm going to rule as king because I am king. My father talked a good game, but when the money was on the line, he backed down. And I'm not going to do that. And Charles I is an interesting person because I think we can say, and I hope this came across last week when we dealt with him, Charles, I don't think, was a man of conviction so much. I think Charles was more a man of power, had that in common with his father, but I think he was more ruthless about it and less intelligent, if I can make the argument, in his pursuit of power. But he argues for the divine right of rule, and he seems often to try to needle people. You know, like he seems to be what we might think of today as like an internet troll, right? Somebody that just enjoys needling people and upsetting them. And so Charles immediately, his father wants to have him marry one of the princesses of Spain. And this is deeply unpopular with the people because, well, not that long ago in Elizabeth's reign, we were at war against Spain. Why would we now? They tried to send their armada up here and destroy us, and now we're going to intermarry with them. But it was strategic. It was the idea that if we had these bonds, we could cease fighting and maybe join up against France. When that falls through, then, oh, you didn't want to marry a Spanish woman? Fine. I'll go to the French court and find a wife. This was the only possibility that would be worse than marrying a Spaniard. So he goes and marries a princess of France, a thorough Catholic. Doesn't seem that he necessarily cared about her religion. It's just he knew this was going to really needle the right people, you know. So he comes back with her, and rumors begin. He's going to try to take us into Catholicism. He's worse than James. He's not better than James. We can see many other things that he does. He tells Parliament, I'm not going to be as patient with you as my father was. Get in line or I'll dissolve you. And they protest, so he dissolves them. And he dissolves them. So generally when you would dissolve Parliament, you do it until the next round, which you'd call usually within 6 months. He dissolves Parliament for 11 years. 11 years. He says, I don't need them. I can rule without them. I'm the king. It'll just be what I say. In fact, what better way to establish that I don't need Parliament than to get rid of them? So he dissolves them and he doesn't recall them. They have no way to recall themselves. And he rules. There's only a problem here, though. There's a huge problem for him, which is Parliament is the only body that can raise taxes. So what's he going to do? Well, he says, I'm the king. I'll raise taxes. So he starts putting taxes on industries and different things. And the people begin to resent him for it, you know, because who does this king think he thinks he is? Only Parliament can do this. You know, it's imagine if a president came out and said, I'm going to throw all these taxes on you that aren't approved by Congress. We would say it's unconstitutional, you know. And we wouldn't be any happier if Congress put them on us, but we would just make the argument it wasn't done right. And it would make us resent it more. And that's exactly what was happening here. People were resenting him for it. And he basically said, I don't care. You know, I'm the king. I'm going to raise these taxes. And if you want to do something about it, have Parliament. Oh, wait a minute. There is no Parliament, right? So nobody can address it. There's no one I answer to. And that's the way it's meant to be. So he was living out the very thing that his father had been arguing for. It made him deeply unpopular with pretty much everybody. I mean, the English people weren't happy. They just thought there's nothing you can do. That's the king. The parliamentarians were not happy. Only maybe the royalist factions were happy, although probably not when they were the ones being taxed. But I'm sure he was choosing wisely who he taxed and when. But anyway, we mentioned that I've tried to mention along the way that what made James so smart was James knew the line, right? If there's a line you don't cross, he didn't cross it. There's something known as too far, right? You go too far. And he seemed to know where that line was. And when he'd get close to it, he'd pull back and make a concession here and there. And it was a smart thing that he did. We used to tell kids, right, you play with matches, you're going to get burnt. You play with fire, you're going to get burnt. Well, there are two things that come back to really burn, and in fact, I would argue burn down the reign of Charles I. And the first one was that since only Parliament could levy taxes and he's out there taxing, to raise the money he needs to live as king and to have new palaces and refurbishing of palaces, the things that kings like, to live the lifestyle that he wanted. He was having to tax people heavily. And it was working. It was working. He was able to tax enough to live comfortably and pay off the people he wanted to pay off, and all the things that you do as a king to keep the reins of power, right? That's exactly what you do, and that's what he did. But a problem developed that's tied to this. The second thing that's contributing to the problem for him is he appoints Archbishop William Laud. We talked about him last week, and we went through all the things that he was putting in place that was deeply unpopular in England. But if you remember, it got worse for him when he tried to impose it on Scotland. And we talked last week about Jenny Geddes and how she picked up her stool and threw it at the pastor for preaching out of the prayer book. And riots began. And then a war began because the Scots said, we've got to go to war if that's what it takes to tell the English crown we are not going to go to Anglicanism. If it means we have to die, we will die before we go to Anglicanism. We are not Anglicans. We are Scots. We are Presbyterians. And so again, the king says, okay, well, I know what I got to do now. I got to put down these Scots. Who do they think they are? I'm the king. Who do they think they are? And but now he's got a real problem. These two streams of problems have merged into one now. Where does he get money to go to war? He needs money. And the only person that can give him money at this point is Parliament. He can't keep going back and taxing people without the consent of the people through Parliament, because it's beginning to be a problem too. So he says, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to use what wealth I have to raise an army, and we're going to go defeat Scotland. Once they see us coming, when you see the king and his soldiers coming, the awe that will fall upon you when you see this is the royal army, they'll surrender before it even gets to it. Well, the very first battle, they get defeated and sent back, and now he knows, I use what little money I have left. What can I do? He recalls Parliament. He recalls Parliament. Now, you're going to be shocked. You won't see this coming. They're not very cooperative, after being disbanded for 11 years. They think, we're not that interested in giving you what you want. In fact, they sit here and go, wait a minute, we kind of side with the Scots. We don't like the Anglican things you're doing. Why would we expect to raise money to go to war against our brothers in Scotland who don't like it? And so they start putting demands on him. He sees this isn't going to go very well for him. So within 3 weeks, he disbands Parliament again. And this is what history calls the short Parliament. If you've ever heard that term, the short Parliament, before, refers to this less than 3 week Parliament that met before getting disbanded. And he thinks, okay, we'll just have to stop prosecuting the war for a time and maybe see if I can, by hook or crook, get a more favorable Parliament in place down the road. The problem is Scotland doesn't agree to stop prosecuting the war. And Scotland is moving down now into English country. And he's got no choice. He's got to fight this battle. He's got to fight. So he goes back and calls Parliament again. And historians argue about why he thought he would have more success this time. It does seem like he was willing to negotiate a little bit this time. Maybe he thought, if I come back a little more humble, they'll meet me part way. Other people think he was using what money he had left to bribe the right people and try to grease the wheels of the law, as happens in any place and time. And so he brings this Parliament back together. And not only are they not willing at all to listen to him or negotiate with him, but they immediately start going to work against his administration. They impeach several of his cabinet members, remove them from office. And Charles is like, what is going on here? I am coming to get funding to go to war. And they put out an arrest warrant against Archbishop Laud, call him a traitor to the throne, that he started this internal war in the kingdom that's already led to the death of thousands of men. They arrest him. Charles thinks, okay, that's a really good show of force. They convict him. He says, okay, your point's been made. They execute him. They execute Archbishop Laud. Now it's pretty clear that these lines are getting distinct here and problems are growing. And Charles still tries to negotiate a little bit. He says, look, we've got something in common here. We need you to deal with the Scots. And it seems like some of the more puritanical elements of Parliament are like, hey, it'll be the greatest thing ever if the Scots come down here and win. They'll throw you out of office and we'll have Presbyterianism here in England. It's like this would be the greatest thing that could ever happen. And so the king realizes he's really backed into a corner now. He's really backed himself into a corner from which there is no escape. At this exact same time, Ireland, who is unhappily under the crown, says, the throne's looking pretty weak right now. The king doesn't look like he's got much authority. He can't even raise an army against an army that's invaded his country. Now's our time to raise up and throw off England. The problem now for the king is Ireland is thoroughly Catholic. And so rumors begin to spread, who knows how true they are, that the king has gone to the Irish and asked them to rebel so that they will raise an army, and he's going to bring the Irish army in to overthrow the more Puritan elements and to go against the Scots. Who knows the truth of any of this stuff? But this is what's rumored. And so they say, oh, Charles, he's raising a Catholic army in Ireland to come against us Protestants and to try to overthrow the very nature of the Anglican Church as a Protestant church. So in all of this, Charles now realizes things are not going my way, and what do leaders do in moments like this? Decisive action. He raises his personal unit of soldiers, 400 men, and he storms the session of Parliament. Goes in there with arrest warrants for 5 of the ringleaders, as he calls them, parliamentarians who are supporting all these things against his administration. He's going to arrest them for treason, clearly have them executed as a message, right? This is a message. This had worked for Mary, kind of in her day, the threat of this. Now he'll do it and it'll calm the storm. Instead, someone in the palace gets word to these 5 men, he's coming for you. So they flee. They flee London. And the king invades Parliament, comes in, they're nowhere to be found. He starts having his soldiers harass the other parliamentarians. Where are they? You know where they are. And the brilliance of this for the more reform-minded parliamentarians, the ones who are more on the parliamentarian side than the royalist side, they had been foreseeing this was inevitable to happen. They started saying, you know what, a day's going to come when he will profane this legal body by entering with his soldiers and saying that he has the right to even come in here and arrest us. I mean, think about what that says. What kind of tyrant would that be if he would ever do that, knowing that eventually this was the end game, right? Eventually it would come to this point. And so even all these other members of Parliament that said, no, we get you don't like Charles, but Charles I would never profane this body. He might dissolve us. He might try to dissolve us, but he would never profane this body by entering with troops to arrest members of this body. Now, why doesn't he dissolve them? He's tried that. So 6 months after he dissolved the short Parliament, and he calls the long Parliament in, and he realizes within 2 weeks Parliament isn't going to do what he wants, he comes and tries to dissolve them again. This would be what would be then the shortest Parliament in history. But to dissolve Parliament, the Speaker has to announce that Parliament is to be dissolved, and he has to bang the gavel on the desk there. And what happens? When they see that he's about to do this, they tackle him, and they hold down his arm and take the gavel from him. And so the gavel never sounds the end of Parliament, and it will not for 20 years. They will not even adjourn at night. They leave, but no one ever bangs the gavel at the end of the day to adjourn Parliament. This is what history calls the long Parliament, because they don't end session for all these years, because they're concerned if they ever actually bang the gavel for the night, someone might find a way to adjourn them. And so it never adjourns. And so he can't dissolve Parliament. They're no longer cooperating in that game with him. And they won't do what he wants, so he tries to arrest them. And now members of Parliament who before had not sided against him are beginning to say the man is a tyrant. He's a tyrant. He's no longer a lawful king, but a tyrant. And we need to think about what we're to do here in this moment. The water's getting a little hot, so the king thinks, I need to find somewhere out of London to be for a while. And so he leaves. And once he does, the royalists begin to feel the brunt of now a larger parliamentarian side and they all leave as well. They all leave London, which leaves a parliament of just parliamentarians, parliament-siding parliamentarians, and largely Puritan ones. And so they say, okay, well, let's start passing laws. Let's start passing resolutions. They pass a resolution that says only Parliament can dissolve Parliament. Only Parliament can raise taxes. We want that clearly in a resolution. They passed that the Church of England is thoroughly Protestant, thoroughly Reformed. And all this is important because I mentioned Charles being a troll. Charles would try to bring in anything he thought would destabilize people. So when he got mad at the Puritans, he tried to start talking about Arminianism. He was hearing about Arminianism. We'll try to bring that into the Church of England. And that did not go over well, as you could imagine. And so they started putting all these statements out, these resolutions saying that we are a Reformed body, we are an Anglican body, but if you will, a Protestant body. And they went through all these statements, and finally the king begins to raise an army with the idea of coming back to London and resolving it. This, whatever point in that whole stream of events you want to say is the beginning of the English Civil War, feel free. Historians argue about this. You can see moments where there was no going back. But when Charles raises an army and moves toward London, raises the army at Nottingham and starts moving toward London, it's pretty clear now we're in the midst of a war because the Parliament passes an act to raise their own army, a professional army. I love the wording of their resolution: to defend the king and Parliament and the nation. And anyway, they go to war against the king. But the king comes to London to attack Parliament. They have the right to defend Parliament. That's in the statute they had passed. The army stands and has a great victory over Charles. He retreats and tries to raise another army so he can come back for a second battle. The problem is Charles's troops aren't great. Parliament has better troops. They have better equipment. They have more money. And history always seems to shine in this way. They end up with a better general. Oliver Cromwell becomes the head of the cavalry of the Parliament army, and just a brilliant general, a brilliant man of strategy. And oftentimes those brilliant men of strategy then are ushered into power at the end. And you won't be surprised that after he defeats the Royalist army through several amazing battles. I don't think Charles ever won a battle. Charles does not want to surrender to Parliament. He surrenders to the Scots. I don't know how that's going to be better. They were probably more angry at him than Parliament was. Scotland eventually turns him over, and he is arrested. And it seems like there's some debate about what to do with him. We know what ends up happening to him, but there's some debate about whether or not he would be willing to sign a statement, a recantation of his policies of the king having a divine right to rule. Whatever the case, he isn't going to sign anything. He isn't going to recant anything. And so at the end, some of the more radical elements, if you will, say as long as he's alive, he's a threat to the nation. He's the king. And so we have to do something to take away his right to be king. And the only way you can rightfully take him off the throne would be something like treason, right? That's it. The problem is, what do you do to a traitor? You execute them. So it's kind of like the only hand they have to play makes the end game inevitable. And so they try him as a traitor, they convict him as a traitor, and then they execute him as a traitor. And King Charles I is beheaded. It's an interesting story. The man was a brave man, stubborn, I think foolish, clearly, but brave. He gets executed in the winter, and as they bring him out, he's cold, and he says, I ask only one thing. I ask that you let me wear a second, heavier shirt so that men don't see me shivering and think I'm afraid, you know. And he went to his death bravely, and no one could believe it. A king killed, right? Who would ever heard of such a thing? And so, except in battle. And so again, the English Civil War ends. It really begins to end there, and that's 1649 when he's executed, January of 1649. It doesn't fully end it because there's still some royalists out there who in their territories have said, we don't like either side, keep us out of it. And so there's still some skirmishes to try to take over the rest of the country and so forth. There's never a time that the protectorate, that's what they call this new era, if you will, under Cromwell, there's no time they had control of the entire nation. There's no time. But about 1651, you could say the war has ended officially. It's ended. And after the king is killed, they put a council together to rule the nation. And, things don't usually run well that way, if you think about it, right? Usually when you have councils, there's arguments, and it's like if you ever try to run something by committee, right? It gets to be a headache and difficult to get consensus. And so this goes well for a while. You might think of it in a way of like in our own history, the Articles of Confederation period of American history. It didn't go very well. And there was a realization we need something a little stronger, a constitution. And so they decide we need something more than this Council of State. We need a leader. We need a good man that we can trust. And so they go to Oliver Cromwell, their great general. Just like in our own nation, George Washington becomes the obvious pick, right? Taller than everybody else, impressive, brave. And Oliver Cromwell is a sort of person that apparently inspired some confidence with his daring do and his strength. And so they go to him and they ask him to be king. And he says no. He says, I have no interest in being king. Parallels there with George Washington, actually another parallel there, in that Washington was offered to be king and said no. He said, no, I will be the head of the state if that's what's desired, but I'm not a king. My rule is not passed down to those who come after me, and so on and so forth. We'll get to that interesting point in just a moment. But he runs this nation from 1653 to 1658 when he dies. And then who becomes the next Lord Protector but his son, Richard Cromwell? We want nothing to look like a kingly line here. But Richard Cromwell is no Oliver Cromwell, as often happens. He's weak. He is not impressive. People know that he wasn't chosen because of merit, but he was chosen because of who his father was. Nobody respects him. He doesn't seem to rule or make decisions well. He is 8 months in that position before people say he's got to go. He's got to go, right? So then they bring back the council. It's no more successful than it was the first time around, which won't surprise anybody. And so what happens? And by the way, these are not unimportant lessons. These are not unimportant lessons. If you just think about history, how did the United States come to have a strong executive branch? Why do we have one of our branches of government which is vested in one man? One man, right? The president is the executive branch. I mean, that's what our Constitution says. That's what the Supreme Court ruled just this past summer. Why did we choose to do that? This is why. They had known from their own history the events that would happen if you had councils and complete bodies that checked each other, and there wasn't in the executive position a unitary authority that held all the power vested in that branch. Congress is different. That's why they get the right to raise the money and make the laws. And the Supreme Court and the court system is not unitary because, again, that's who puts the check on these things. But in terms of executive position and executing those laws and so forth, they decided to vest it in one man. And because they had seen what happened in times where it was divided too much, it ended up being a mess. Again, I say, as Americans, we ought to really realize how much the history of the British people informs our own history, because that's where we came from. And so, anyway, but as we look at this, they have this council, and it's a disaster too. And people begin to whisper, we were better off under Charles. We were better off under Charles. Now that's almost unthinkable until things get so bad, right? It's like, I've said this many times, but when Iraq was in the midst of war after the invasion, so 2008, 2009, and you'll remember bombs were going off in markets constantly as you had ISIS in Iraq involved and different warlords and so forth at war. And some people began to say it was better under Saddam Hussein. Why? Because here's all you had to do to survive under Saddam Hussein. Don't criticize Saddam Hussein. Now you go to the market to buy your groceries, you might get blown up. Your children might get blown up. So this is a very similar idea to what people were saying in this day. Under Charles, at least things were stable. At least we knew who was in charge. At least there was some continuity in things. Now everything's constantly up in the air. And as a result, in 1660, they asked the exiled son of Charles I, Charles II, please come home. Please let us submit to your rule. Rule and reign over us again. Give us a king. Give us a king, that we might be like all the nations of the world. Now, I told you we were going to end our study in 1660. There's so many things beyond this that are interesting, but we don't have time in this study to do them. We'll look at some of those things next fall. But I will say this. During that time that Parliament holds power and holds sway, we talked about a lot of resolutions they're passing. One of the things that they begin to do, once the king is clearly on the outs, he's losing, they don't have possession of him in the early stages, where they're going to say, you know what we ought to do while we have control? Let's make this country what we want it to be. Let's make our church what we want it to be. And so Parliament brings together what amounts to something like an advisory committee. And we know them as the Westminster Assembly. We're going to talk about this a little bit more next week, but I think it's important to say this now, to see this development during this time of what's going on. The Westminster Assembly is called together in 1643. So that's about a year after the war officially begins or so. And this is, like I said, Charles is already losing, resoundingly losing at this point. And they bring together the Westminster Divines, and they ask for a body of men who they knew would have puritanical sensibilities, a group of men who would be very much in line with the reformational movement of the continent. They wanted the Anglican Church to look more like the Reformed churches of Europe, not to be so independent, not to be so set apart and different. And, the biggest group of such men in England were Presbyterians. And so they had a large number of Presbyterians, obviously, on this Westminster Assembly. A few other people that were lumped in with them as well. But they said, we want you to do 4 things. We want you to put together 4 things. We often talk about the confession itself, the Westminster Confession, the Westminster Longer Catechism, the Shorter Catechism, and the Book of Order, which was the book of the way the church and the Church of England would run. And I heard Stephen Nichols say that's the forgotten one, that's the forgotten standard. But the other 3 are still very much in use. And I actually wish that we Baptists had followed their lead on that as well, and done a shorter and a longer catechism, because their reasoning was the confession says what we believe. The shorter catechism is for use in homes and classes. It's for the people. It's for the church. It's for the body of believers. And then the longer catechism is for the training of teachers and preachers and elders and that sort of thing. It's a more in-depth answer, maybe a little more advanced. But again, it's useful. And we Baptists we just did the confession and the catechism, which is really a shorter catechism. And I think we would have been wise to do a longer one as well. But anyway, they did this, and they put together these things that have stood the test of time. And we're going to look at the theology of it a little bit more next week. But you see the effect, the power of the Puritan movement. And I want to say just a few words about the Puritan movement. I've mentioned before, it's hard to talk about Puritanism because, we mentioned you could do a class on the Puritans, right? We could do a 16-week class on the Puritans. You could take a night on some of the great Puritans. I mean, we could talk about Bunyan for a whole night easily. I mean, we spent 2 semesters looking at just 2 of his books and talking about him during that time. Thomas Goodwin, right? Richard Sibbes. We could go on and on, these great Puritans. And just talking about the English Puritans, I'm talking about the American Puritans, the Jonathan Edwards and all of those men that were so instrumental in our own country in founding all of our great institutions. All of our great institutions. I mean, when you think about what are our most prestigious universities, I mean, not as prestigious as they once were, but Harvard, started by Puritans. Yale, started by Puritans. Princeton, started by Puritans. For what purpose? To train pastors. And so again, we'll talk about some of that stuff next fall as well, as we get to America becoming a part of the story more and more so. But as you think about these standards that they came up with, these Westminster standards, are incredible. They've stood the test of time, but they also were incredibly influential. You know, if you've read and I recommend you do this sometime when you have time, if you read the First London Baptist Confession, it is very different from the Westminster Confession. I mean, the theology is in a lot of areas similar, but the structure is completely different. And some people I love the structure actually of the First London Baptist Confession. It's got 52 articles. That's almost perfect for church, isn't it? You just read an article a week as part of your church service. It's brilliant. But something happened after they wrote the First London Baptist Confession. The Westminster Assembly had met and published their amazing confession of faith. And the Baptists read that and said, we agree on 90% of everything. We disagree on a couple of points. And so they said, we need to write our own new confession. We use their confession as the backbone to say where it is we disagree. So you'll read through it. Most of the confession is in high agreement with one another. And then they come to a few things like their discussion of the covenants is different. The Baptist confession is a little different on. And so we have these two documents. We, in a way, are advantaged in that sense. We have two documents that agree together. By the way, I want to say this because you'll hear people say, we hold to the First London Baptist and not the Second London Baptist. That's really nonsense because it isn't the exact same men who signed both, but there's no question there's no difference in what they believed. The reason that the covenants are not as much outlined in the First London Baptist Confession is because it wasn't an issue of any disagreement. You only usually write down those things you're trying to elucidate or talk about differences on, which is why it comes up in the Second Confession, because they say we don't agree with our Presbyterian brothers on this. But you'll hear some people that we would respect, who will say we hold to the First London Baptist Confession because we don't hold to the construction of the Second London Baptist Confession's covenant theology. We hold to New Covenant theology is often what they'll say. The problem with this is the men that you're saying I stand with wouldn't have stood with you. They would not. They would have said, we don't believe that. We believe what's in the Second London Baptist Confession. And we know that for a fact. So I think it's a little bit tricky, I'll be honest with you, a little deceptive to say we hold to the First London Baptist Confession when you know those men didn't hold to what you're teaching. They just didn't say it in that document. So you're making an argument for silence. But anyway, little hobby horse I have to hop on every once in a while. But it's an important hobby. We need to understand our Baptist fathers didn't come up with all new ideas in 40 years. They didn't. And so again, but that Second Confession is largely on the framework of the Westminster Confession. Now we could argue to be more exacting, it was really more on the Savoy Declaration, and the Savoy Declaration was on the outline of the Westminster. The Savoy is the one done by the Congregationalists like John Owen and many other great men. But again, they're all very similar. And it's a really interesting thing to lay them side by side, section by section, and just see the differences. And where there are differences, you know this was important. These were things that they said, this is a distinctive of ours, and a place that we needed to have a little more expression on. But I want to say this, the Puritans had a rough time. The reason we call it the London Baptist Confession of 1689 is not that it was written in 1689, it was published in 1689. It was written long before that, but they couldn't publish it legally because under Charles II it would have been a crime. This is the age where men like Bunyan are put in jail under Charles II. So what we saw under Charles I comes back under Charles II. That's not our purview tonight, but it is to say that the Puritans dealt with this for decades. And Media Gratia has a documentary on the Puritans. And our church has a copy of it. I mentioned this one time before when we got an order from Reformational Heritage Books. They included the teaching set in our order for free and just as a gift. And they messed up our order a little bit. And I told you all that they did to make that right, which we didn't even ask them to make it right. They were just super generous. And a good sign of a Christian company that they want to make it right even when you're not asking them to. And they sent us another copy of it when they fixed the order. And so we actually have two copies of it. But it's a course on the Puritans. And it has a movie, a 2-hour movie on the Puritans that is kind of the heart of that thing. And in that, it's talking about, you have men like John Piper and other men in the church today who are talking about the Puritans and talking about what made that time so special, what made that maybe in some sense the high point in church history in terms of scholarship and thinking of Scripture. Martin Lloyd-Jones said that if all of church history was like the Himalayan mountains, the age of the Puritans was Everest. That it was the highest heights we've ever reached. I think he's right about that. And I've said there are good books written today, but the best books written today are basically quoting the Puritans. They're basically, those authors are going back and saying, let's look back at what they said. And the things that aren't like that, I'll be honest, I think Spurgeon said in the late 1800s, you can take all the books written today and exchange them for a single Puritan work, and you'll profit. And anyway, I think there's some truth in that. But to say this, those men were thinking because they did it in the fires of affliction. It cost them something to take their stand. It's one thing to say, what would you do? What would you do if the government said you have to give up Christianity or you'll be put in prison? And we can sit here and say what we would do. But they weren't even given that easy a choice. They were like, what will you do? Go to a government Protestant church or go to jail? You can easily justify going to it's not perfect, but it's still a Protestant church and they are still teaching the gospel, and I can go there, and I'm not going to be happy about it, but I won't go to jail. Again, these aren't men who are told give up Jesus or go to jail. These are men like John Bunyan told quit preaching these Baptist beliefs or go to jail. Presbyterians told quit preaching about elders or go to jail. These are men told if you don't quit preaching, you'll be ejected from the church. The great ejection that happens one Sunday when they're told if you don't recant of your beliefs and join under the Anglican umbrella, you're out. And they passed a 5-mile rule. You cannot hold a religious assembly within 5 miles of a church you formerly pastored. And they kept passing all these laws to discourage these men from preaching, and yet they didn't. They said, throw me in jail. I'll have more people to preach to, and that's what they did. That's what they did. And so again, when we speak about that unique Puritan era, I pray what you see is these were men who it cost them something. Women too, who it cost them something to stand on their beliefs. It wasn't just, some theological point. It was to them life or death. And it's often been said of Bunyan that he was in a jail cell to which he held the key. Might think about Mayberry, right, where the key's just hanging outside. Notice can open the cell for himself. What do they mean by that? What do they mean that Bunyan had the key to his own jail cell? All he had to do was say, I give in. I give in. I'll show up next week at the Anglican church and I'll just worship with you guys. And he stood so firmly that would be a violation of his own Christian conscience that he stayed in jail for over a decade. Over a decade. My friends, these were admirable and I think uniquely bold believers, whether we agree with them or not. Obviously, there's Baptists who are Puritans, there's Presbyterians who are Puritans, there's Congregationalists who are Puritans. We don't agree with every point with all of them. But we can say about all of them, these people had a boldness that we don't have in the church today. A commitment to their beliefs we don't see in the church today. And my friends, if you want to see why our churches are so weak today and why the Puritan movement could not be killed, though kings tried to kill it, look at that. Look at the people who stood and said, here's what we believe. And like Luther, here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. And again, once it became easy to be a Puritan, and Puritanism began to wane. And I just want to share this at the end. Persecution is not a curse upon the church. We don't like it. We don't like it. But there's an old saying that goes back to our English forefathers, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And wherever the church is persecuted, it's grown. And when the church is unpersecuted, it gets lazy. It's easy to believe, and people act like it's easy to believe. They're not committed. I remember hearing years ago about a missionary that went to China, And he told a Chinese house pastor that had been just released from prison in China. He said, we in America are praying that persecution will stop in China. And that house leader said, that's funny. We're praying that persecution will come to America. And he said, why on earth would you pray that? And he said what I just said. Wherever the church is persecuted, she gets power and she grows and she flourishes. And wherever she has freedom, she gets weak and lazy and sad. And so, my friends, as you see this Puritan age, it is not surprising to us that there is persecution hand in hand. Now, let me say this. I don't want to be misinterpreted here. We have freedom to be here tonight. Praise God for it. We have freedom to come Sunday. Praise God for it. But if persecution comes, praise God for it. Praise God, because in all things He's working for the good of the church. Doesn't mean you have to like persecution. I'm not going to be enjoying sitting in prison one day if that's my lot. But am I going to say God has failed me? I give up on the gospel? No, I'll be preaching the gospel in jail until they throw me in solitary, and then I'll be singing hymns in there. Right? That's what we have to do. That's what we do as believers. And we have a model of that in Paul, who, thrown in jail, sang hymns and spiritual songs past midnight. And we have an example in our Lord Jesus Christ, who endured the cross, it says in Hebrews, why? For the joy set before Him. For the joy set before Him. My friends, the Puritans are extraordinary, and I think that's one of the reasons why we continue to love them so much, or should. Anyway. All right, any questions, comments, thoughts?
So, help me with this. I'm kind of embarrassed that I don't know the answer, but the Westminster Confession comes out of England.
Yes.
The Church of the State of England is the Anglican Church.
Yes.
But the Westminster Confession is the bedrock of the Presbyterian Church.
Yes.
It comes out of Scotland.
Yes.
Help me with
How any of that makes sense?
why the Westminster Confession isn't the bedrock of the Anglican.
Yes. So it has to do with the fact that the protectorate didn't last, right? So they put this document in place to be more like the Continental Reformed and to be more like Scotland. That's what that Westminster Assembly did, and that's what Parliament wanted them to do. And for the Anglican Church, right. And for that brief time, it was the rule. It kind of replaced the 39 Articles and that sort of thing. But when that era ended and Charles II came back, he was like, we're going back to Anglicanism and we're going to go back to the 39 Articles, and the Westminster was pushed to the side. Although, again, one of the I guess we would say the great courageous things about the Puritans are Presbyterian Puritans would refuse to give up their confession. They refused to give up the Westminster. And it had made its way to Scotland. And like you said, we actually think of it more as associated with Scotland in some way and Presbyterianism. But there were many Presbyterian Puritans, English Puritans, who said, this is our document and we're going to hold on to it. And so there are English churches that would consider that as a part of their heritage, the Westminster Confession. And so that's kind of how that works. But Scotland looked at that document. The Presbyterian churches really all over the world looked at that document and said, that's it. You know, they expressed what it is we believe. And so it just kind of got adopted by churches all over the world. You know, just like you might think, you know, our church's history as a direct body has no link to Britain, but we're using the London Baptist Confession. So we just adopted it at some point, right? It's kind of like that's what we hold to. But in the same sense, in Scotland, that's what they did. But in England, it is kind of a part of the English heritage and the Scottish Presbyterian heritage and so forth. But it's an outstanding document. That's why it stood the test of time. And if you think about it, the groups so a lot of groups claim to hold to the Westminster standards, right? A lot of people have that as in their documents. But we think about certain denominations within Presbyterianism that do so seriously. In other words, they really do enforce it. And that'd be like, say, the PCA, OPC, some of those groups. And to them, it's not just a historical document, right? It's their governing document. And so, you know, you'll see this a lot of times where people will say, there's Baptist churches. right? But let me be more specific. There are Southern Baptist churches that say we stand by the 2000 Southern Baptist faith and message, and yet there's places they're in great disagreement with it, and they don't. It doesn't matter because it's just like, we're Southern Baptists. We have to say we agree with it. But in the OPC, for instance, it's a big deal, right? That you remain under the Westminster standards, and so it's just Anglicanism hasn't done that. If you want to see what the great difference between how seriously those standards were taken, Anglicanism, you would have a hard time going to England today on a Lord's Day and walking into a church that really holds the 39 Articles. Now, they'll have them as their document. They'll say, we hold to the 39 Articles. But the number of churches that literally hold, J.I. Packer said this years ago, you'd have trouble finding a church that holds strictly to the 39 Articles. And, one of the reasons I mentioned St. Helens of Bishopgate, I love that church. That's one of the Anglican churches, although I'm not sure they may have actually left Anglicanism at some point, but they were one that held to the 39 Articles and said, why call yourself Anglican if you don't, right? That's what defines us. And so, again, these confessions we'll get back to next week, but that's kind of how it worked. They came up with this confession for the Anglican Church, and the Scots said, hey, that's pretty good. It's pretty good document you came up with there. And it was. It was. I only slightly prefer the London Baptist Confession, but I have to admit, it's because we borrowed so much, from the Westminster. Anyway, all right. Any other questions?
So is this class now still on Reformation, or is it switched to a class on English church history?
Well, English church.
It feels like it's turned to a different topic.
Yeah. Well, English Reformation is a big part of the Reformation. If you think about all the groups that we have in the Reformation that we think of today, from our perspective, in either Europe or in the United States, most of the lines, if you will, go back through England. Actually, now they go back before that through Scotland and through Switzerland and so forth, all back to Germany and France and all these places. But the history of Britain is huge in this, and the Reformation, you think about it like this, with the story of the Lutheran Church, which we did our first 2 weeks on Luther and Lutheranism, one generation it was largely decided. In the Swiss, one generation it was largely decided. There was no period where, say for instance in Geneva, it's like, oh, we almost lost the Reformation. No, once it was on firm footing, it was solid. England's unique amongst the major Reformed nations in that it was back and forth and almost lost. And so this is a story that played out over a long, long period of time. It starts there almost earlier in some sense than other nations with Wycliffe, and it lasts longer. It's not until after Charles II and the glorious revolution that happens with William and Mary that you can say, okay, now it finally feels like, as we get to the 1700s, it finally feels like the Reformation's taken foot in England and it's safe. So that's something like 350 years that the Reformation battle's happening in England. So that's longer, much longer than you'd see in Switzerland or Germany. So that's one of the reasons we've had to talk about it so much more. And our own history comes through there. That's where Baptists come from. In fact, I've mentioned this before, but the first London Baptist Confession of Faith, what was their main reason for writing it? They got tired of being called Anabaptists. In fact, it says that if you go to our library and get that first London Baptist Confession, open the front where it's got a facsimile of the original thing, it says something like, a confession of London Baptists assembling together to end the confusion over us being Anabaptists, or something like this, And the second London Baptist Confession, not so much. They were like, we need to fully put out what it is we believe so that everybody knows, and they can hold side by side the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians and the Baptists, and people can decide which one of these do we believe, which one is it. And so anyway. But that's why England's so important, especially to us, as I slap the microphone, especially to us. Any other questions?
Not really a question, but kind of more of a comment on that. I think it's not only important to talk about how we broke with Rome on these things, but also to talk about how the Reformation actually built something.
Yes.
We're talking about, okay, these confessions, these institutions that we built. Because like the Reformation wasn't just like, okay, we don't like Rome.
Right.
We want to be in line with the church that was before.
Yes.
That means you're building something. So
Yes.
you have to.
I think that's well said. And, that's right. And that's why the Reformation doesn't end. Why the arguments of the Reformation doesn't end with Anglicanism in the British stream. Because again, if it's just breaking with Rome, that's been done now, right? And Elizabeth thought that's enough, that they'll be satisfied with breaking from Rome. But the Puritan sides, right, were saying, no, it's not enough, right? There's further we've got to go to be with the scriptures. Now, they disagreed on those things, right? We realize that. But yeah, it wasn't just about simply, we just need to give the stiff arm to Rome and then we're over here. There were theological battles going on what the church should look like and how do we look like what Christ left us, right? What the early church was and what was handed down through all those generations. And we've talked about that along the way. How do we get back to what the church should be? And that's really the argument of the Reformation and why it never ends. In a way, we argue the Reformation never ends, right? Because again, even in the early church, there's arguments going on, right? About how do we live out the scriptures? And those arguments continue throughout church history. We're never at a point where we say, I assume, this side of glory will never be at a point where we're like, we got it exactly right. There's nothing left to argue about, figure out, we've got it all 100% right. And there's probably danger if we ever get to the point where we think that, right? Where if we think we stand, we might find out we're sinking. But we're always reforming. That's the reason they said that, because we always need to be taking what we're doing and going back to the scriptures and saying, is this right? Is this right? And so anyway, ongoing. Any others?
I'm curious, I know you're going to get into this next week.
Mhm.
Puritans, are you going to go into like specific men or mostly
So
their doctrine?
mostly doctrine. We can talk about some men. Do you have a question about?
No, I'm just thinking, my mind goes everywhere.
Mhm.
Especially since there were American Puritans
Yes.
early in our founding. What was the cause? What happened? Because I'm just thinking back at 40 years ago and
Mhm.
coming to faith and out of Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
And like, why was that not? There were no Puritans. I didn't hear anything about the Puritans,
Mhm.
their doctrine and their writings. Has that always been pretty strong within the Presbyterian denomination?
So
CA.
yeah. So if you would say like what we would call like Orthodox Presbyterianism that goes back to the, has some tracing back, not some of the liberal forms of Presbyterianism we'd see today, then they hold pretty strongly to those definitives of Presbyterian, which we would say are like the doctrines of grace. We would say the Westminster Standards, those sorts of things. They hold to those. I wasn't sure if you were asking why we didn't hear that much growing up. Like I didn't hear that much either. No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
I was a part of. Because
Yeah.
I feel like they're such rich. I mean, and the more I've grown and learned and read of them, I'm like, who would have ever put that away?
Yeah.
Just discarded it.
So if you go to, I think it's at the end of that Puritan documentary, I think Joel Beakey says something about if we ever stop teaching these things to the next generation, I'm paraphrasing, they easily disappear. And I've spoken, I don't try to just like smack down Baptist thought, that's my background in the 20th century, but I'm saying I grew up and knew nothing of Reformation Day. I think the only teaching I ever heard about the Reformation was in public school. I remember in school they talked about Martin Luther in history class, That's all I ever learned about it. And I remember, why am I a Baptist? Well, I grew up in a Baptist church. That's as far as I could figure it out. And, I don't know if I could have told you where the Baptists and Presbyterians disagree. And the point I'm getting at is I think there was an age in the American church where there wasn't a lot of depth. The old adage, you hear it a lot, they're talking about Bill Hybels' church in Chicago. He built this massive church and of course ended up in scandal, but He built this massive church, and tons of people came to it. And then they had a tragedy in the church, and nobody was prepared to deal with tragedy. Because, I think that you hear this saying a lot, but this is where I first heard it. They said they had built a church that was a mile wide and a quarter-inch deep. And I kind of, unfortunately, feel like that's the 20th century American church. We were a quarter mile wide, or a mile wide and a quarter-inch deep. We lost our distinctives, right? We didn't want to be Baptists if Baptist meant we might offend somebody and they wouldn't come to our church. We're like, who cares about baptism? If you want to come to our church, we'll set that stuff aside. And Presbyterianism went the same way. That's why you have like the PCUSA and so forth, where they're like, we just care about numbers and success. And, we learned from...
Baptist bookstore changed its name.
It may be, yeah. I've heard people say, if we want to have a future, not our church specific, I mean churches, you got to drop Baptist from the name, go to community, go to whatever. And it's like, we ought to be proud of our history. I mean, we've got a great history. Just like Presbyterian churches, they ought to keep their name. They ought to be proud of their history. But know your history, right? Know your history. And I'm happy to tell you that if you're interested in, I'm going to keep bringing up Reformation Heritage books, but they just had their Puritan sale, and we were able to pick up 17 books, 15 of which are hardcover books, for like $170, like $10 a piece, hardcover books. 4 of those books are a set of 3 volumes of biographies of the Puritans, all short biographies of the Puritans. So you can check out one of those volumes and get like 20 biographies of Puritans and just read them one at a time. And then we've got a 4th volume. It is a paperback book, but it's the lives of the American Puritans. And it I think, highlights maybe 12 American Puritans in short biography, so you can understand more about it. These are things we need to know and need to learn about because, again, I've said this before, and I don't take this, I don't say this with glee or joy. I say this with heartache, in a sense, because I remember in college, and I think I've shared this with you all, at ETSU years and years ago, I used to play tennis with a good friend of mine. He was from Sri Lanka, not a Christian. And Allison knew him quite well too. And not a Christian, didn't claim to be a Christian. And he knew I had grown up in church. I wasn't in church at that point in my life. And he would ask me questions about the Bible. He said, "You went to church?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Explain to me this." And I'd be like, "I can't explain it." I mean, just like basic doctrinal stuff that we would hope now, our students in the church would know. And he would say, "Well, could it be?" And he would give an answer that now I look back and go, yeah, he was right. I grew up in church and he knew more about the Bible than I did. And I'm just saying that should break our hearts, guys. That should break our hearts. And so I think, there's a lot of things where I think the way to look forward for the church, clearly you can see this the way I see it, to look forward for our church is to look backward, right? To look back at what people were doing generations ago that worked. And, you see me, I don't put a lot of time. I mean, I don't put a lot of time into stories and jokes in my sermons because, I grew up in an age where that's what a lot of preaching was poems and stories and jokes. And I can tell you this, and I love the men who were my pastors as children. I'm not saying anything bad about them. That's how they were trained. We have to understand that's what the seminaries were producing in those days. And they're like, you need jokes to get your people's attention, and you need stories, and you need this, and you need to have personal stories about your own lives so they'll see how it relates and all that. And yet, when I think back about my childhood, all the things I can remember from sermons are jokes. That's what I remember. And I remember some good ones. I remember some good jokes. I tell them sometimes to people, but that's what I remember. That's what I remember. And I didn't understand the gospel, not well enough. I didn't understand our Baptist history, not well enough. And so a lot of why we do this emphasis on education and the literature table and the library and these things on Wednesday nights is we need this as a people. And I know you can see here, not everybody's here on a Wednesday night. And I've said this before, it hasn't caught on with everybody, that this is important. But can you imagine just a vision for a moment for a church that all of its members were trained like seminarians? that all of the members of the church knew systematic theology, biblical theology, covenant theology, the history of the church, Old Testament theology, New Testament, all of it. You knew it all. Imagine what kind of church that could be. And so that's why we do this on Wednesday nights, and learning the history of the books. Pilgrim's Progress, we did that the first spring, and we did Pilgrim's Progress 2 the second spring. We're doing the Holy War this upcoming spring. Why read fictional works? Because they're glorious, and because they have informed generation upon generation about the Christian faith. And you'll hear pastors sometimes that say, I didn't learn that, strangely enough, from the Bible. It's not that the Bible doesn't teach us, but it's like all that seed work that was done in the preaching of the Word clicked for me when I heard it in Pilgrim's Progress. It's like that's where it finally like, oh, wait a minute. Bunyan's trying to tell me something here about the Christian life. And what made me decide that we needed to do things like that was I saw Derek Thomas's lectures through Pilgrim's Progress, and he was talking about when he was first at seminary teaching, he would ask, how many of you have read Pilgrim's Progress? And he said, like almost every hand would go up in the class. And he said his last few years, he would say, how many of you have read Pilgrim's Progress? And maybe one hand would go up or two hands would go up. We're losing our history. We're losing all the things our parents and their grandparents cared about. The 3 books, almost every Christian, Presbyterian, Baptist, Anglican, the 3 books almost every Christian who read English would have read were the Bible, Fox's Book of Martyrs, and Pilgrim's Progress. And now you go to most churches, nobody's read Pilgrim's Progress, nobody's read Fox's Book of Martyrs, and most people aren't reading the Bible very often, right? That's just the reality. And so we need to hope better things, right? Hope better things. And so anyway, I don't know how I got on that. Anyway, Lisa, but I got running. You got me running. But anyway, I lament some of those things too, that we never heard about these things. And we have a rich history to learn about. And I haven't done justice to any of it. I mean, this is not being humble. This is when you go back and look at all the avenues that branch off of all the things we've talked about over these 13 weeks, so much we didn't even cover. And important things, but we only have so many hours, right? And anyway, so any other questions?
What kind of history, I mean, probably everybody else in here would know this, but when did the king in England no longer have power? I mean,
It's a process. So you got Magna Carta, so you begin to see a restriction, if you will, and then you have these events that are slowly kind of ticking back as Parliament becomes more important. It's a battle. Times the king has more. It's almost like the Pope and kings, in that same way we looked at that, particularly, I guess, more last fall. Sometimes the kings have more power, sometimes the papacy has more power. It's like that for a long stretch during this time, that it's kings or it's Parliament. But over time, the king and queen, and I don't know exactly where that would be, yeah, they are. I mean, they still have some say in some certain things, but largely it's more of like the bully pulpit, the moral authority for the nation, which is why the queen, you'd see her for years addressing those important times of the year, Christmas and Easter, speaking for the people and all. But Victoria still had quite a bit of power. That's not all that long ago. But it just over time, I don't know the exact date on the first prime minister. There were positions like we're talking about during Henry's reign of Thomas Cromwell. He was something like the minister of the nation, but I don't know how that compares to our. I mean, he's still clearly under the king's authority, so it's.
authority of the Anglican Church now.
Well, technically, it is our third Charles who is the head of the church. I mean. There is you do have the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's the head of the system of the church, but the sovereign is the head of the church. So the sovereign is, the supreme governor of the church is the term, has a heavy say in who becomes prime minister, although I don't think it's quite what it once was. I mean, 100 years ago, they would appoint him. I think now it's more of like a committee and the sovereign gives their approval of it. But so I don't think it's the same level of authority even there. But I will say this, and I've said it many times. You've heard me say things like, there's really not been a good King Charles in British history. We saw Charles I. We saw Charles II just briefly. He brings back some of the things. And And then this current Charles, I mean, nobody rises to power without God's hand. So, he's in power. But a lot of what the Queen Elizabeth did to kind of restrain modernity from the Anglican Church, which was itself a struggle, and it still happened even with her at the realm, there'll be a whole lot less rein pulling now. So I think that's why I say earlier, I know there was some talk about like St. Helens of Bishopgate at one point that maybe they would have to exit because they still hold the 39 Articles. And so we'll see. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting era to see how these things play out in all of our churches, really. I mean, let's face it. I don't know of a church that doesn't have, a denomination that doesn't have struggles. I mean, we're seeing the Southern Baptist Convention right now that just continues to wage. The PCA has had their own struggles in certain topics. I mean, so everywhere you look, there's issues, and it's always going to be that way. It's always this battle that's going on to either update the church to the modern thought and time, and the other side battling to keep the confessional basis of the church. And that's going to be a battle that will always go on. In the Church of England, it's largely lost. Like I said, if you can find hardly a church at all that holds the 39 Articles in actual action, I don't just mean principally, it's not easy to do. So.
Did Lloyd Jones's church?
He wasn't Anglican.
He was not out?
No, he was not Anglican. His church, it is called Westminster, but it was more of like a non-denominational church. Yeah, no. So there's a long history of nonconformity, and after a while, the Baptists were free to meet, and the Presbyterians were free to meet, and the Congregationalists, and actually, there's some interesting times where J.I. Packer talks about his interactions with Lloyd Jones and how they deeply disagreed on Anglicanism, because Lloyd Jones was something like I don't know if you call it a separatist, but a nonconformist would be the term they would use, and he would say, how can you, Lloyd Jones, how can you be a part of that Anglican church, and that sort of thing. And that, by the way, if you've read Evangelicalism Divided, and please read that at some point if you haven't, this is the argument, right, that Lloyd Jones has. You're going to send people, Billy Graham, you're going to send people to these churches that are wolves. And so, you're going to argue they're going to get saved by the Holy Spirit in this revival, and then you're going to send them to people who don't even believe the faith. And they're going to get eaten alive. And Martin Lloyd-Jones says, if that's what you're going to do, I will have no part in it. And Billy Graham had wanted him to head it up. So again, that's a place where you see that division. He's like, no. We need to have a vetting process for the churches to make sure they're good churches. And then only send people to those churches where they'll be nourished. And Billy Graham was like, yeah, but he didn't. I'm paraphrasing, but it's more or less the argument. But that might hurt the numbers. Like that might, we might not have the full involvement of the Church of England if we do that, and they wouldn't have. And so, you have to come down on practicality versus, taking a stand and who was right on that. And I know John Stott did not think that Martin Lloyd-Jones was right on that and criticized him publicly, and then later apologized and said, you were right. You were right on that. And I certainly think he was right in that particular case. And by the way, read some of the churches, what they were teaching. It's not just nebulous. That book gives you some examples of the things that were being taught in some of the churches they were sending people to. And it's an absolute violation of any creed you want to hold to, an argument that Jesus was not only not divine in some of these churches, but was the product of human fornication, this sort of thing. I'm trying to say this carefully and not get my blood boiling here, because it should boil our blood to hear some of this. But he was like, you're going to send people to churches that are preaching that. And hey, to get the endorsement and help of the Anglican Church, we got to do what we got to do. And Martin Lloyd-Jones was more like Luther on this, burn it down, just don't have a revival then, if that's what it's going to be. Or have a smaller one, but one where the people are going to good churches. Like I said, I don't have any question which side of that debate I would have been on. Anyway. Any other questions or comments before we close down? All right, well, let's have a word of prayer and then a verse of a song, and we'll call it a night. Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for this history. Father, help us to see how important to us it is. And Father, help us to be thankful to be here and to come back Sunday for worship. In Christ's name.